Do you remember the first time you were in this room, or in this building?
Oh, I do, actually. I think I came here initially to be interviewed by Neil McDonald before I was admitted to the program. And I remember this place as being a very interesting building. Actually, it had been used before the Eagleton Institute was formed as a building that people came to for tea and stayed as like an inn. I had a roommate at college who worked here, so I had probably been inside the building, maybe, I'm not sure. It seemed more off limits to me then. But when I came in, I thought it was such an elegant building to have for your classroom. It was amazing.
How was the program presented to you? What did you think you were coming for?
Well, I guess I thought I was coming to learn more about politics. I came from a family that didn't like politicians. My father was an immigrant. He had never voted. My mother had never voted, but she was not an immigrant, but she would complain heartily about politicians. They were all crooks. And so I don't know where I got this idea, except that I had taken a couple classes with Neil McDonald and Jim Rosenau, and I had decided that while I initially wanted to be a social worker to help people, that really it was through government change that you could do the most good. And we had a seminar here on practical politics, which I thought was the best part of the program. And then the other courses were taken across town normally. We had statistics and state government, and we had American history with Dr. McCormick, the former president's father. And we had one called Politics and Propaganda. And we had politicians in residence here, and I remembered Edmund Muskie particularly, and Jesse Unruh.
So Muskie was then senator from Maine, and Unruh was from California.
And, yeah, because I don't remember when Muskie was initially elected.
He had been governor of Maine.
Right, he had been. Yeah. But when they came here, they actually slept upstairs. And actually, Don Hertzberg slept on the other side. He and his family had the apartment and a kitchen. And
then the director of the institute. He was the director.
He was the first director, right? And he had this apartment with his wife Marlene, and they had a child whom they called John, and I guess after the Kennedy John. Okay. So anyway, it was a very informal atmosphere. But one night, I slept here because it snowed heavily, and there was no way to get across town, and I didn't have a car, my roommate had the car, and so I was invited to stay. So I actually slept in the bedroom where the politicians used to sleep, and that was quite a thrilling. So it was all a very, and it was just a very, and we only had 5 people in that first group.
And did Eagleton help you find a job after that? Or
Don Hertzberg would make suggestions, and his suggestions were, one of them was a job at UConn in a department like Department of Government Services that was over at Rutgers. And actually to get to the University of Connecticut was really very difficult. I did not own a car, and one had to take the train, the bus, whatever, and it seemed like it was out of the woods, and I was not interested. And may well have been also because I had met Art Holland here when I was, when I didn't want to go off to this hinterland. But anyway, so I went to work, I went back to New York City, and there were some women I knew there. And one of them knew the director of this organization called the National Committee for an Effective Congress, which was across the street from the library on 42nd Street. And this man said, get you a job there. So it was a very tiny office, and what they were doing was raising money for liberal candidates for the Congress. And I worked there during that build up to the election in '59, I guess, or 60.
So you left here in May of '58, I
right.
guess?
And so I started working. I worked at home as a waitress probably during the summer, and in the fall I went up there. And so anyway, we were soliciting money. We had programs. Dory Shary and Eleanor Roosevelt came to one of the hotels and as a fundraiser. And so after the election was held, George Agri, who was the director, said, "We can't afford to keep you any longer. Do you think, why don't you look at these people who ran and won and see if you find anybody that you're interested in?" And it was a big freshman class of senators that year. And I did, and he said to me, do you think Don Hertzberg would write you a letter of reference? And I said, I'm pretty sure he would. So I asked Don if he would. So I sent letters to Proxmire, Phil Hart, maybe Joe Cannon, a couple of others. I can't remember all of them. And I didn't really get any response. I mean, it was still, maybe they were still getting settled. And so Agri said, well, you can go down to Washington and work for us down there. And then one day I got a call from Bill Welsh, who was the administrative assistant to Phil Hart. And
Phil Hart was a new senator from Michigan.
Yes, right. And he asked me if I was still looking for a job, and I said I was. And he said that Don had given, and he knew Don, because if Don had worked for one of the Connecticut Congress people. So anyway, he hired me, and I got to work initially as I was the appointment secretary and the receptionist. It was a very informal office. We were down in the basement because the man that Hart had succeeded had been a paraplegic. And so he had his office over in the Capitol building, and they had no place for Hart. So we were in 114 down in the basement, and in the corner was some, I know Bobby Kennedy had an office, and he was, when he became the deputy, he was working for one of the investigative committees at the time, the Kefauver committee, I guess. And so anyway, and that's what I did, and then I got to be elevated to be the assistant to the legislative assistant, which gave me more to do. And this one day, these two men came in, youngish guys, and one of them knew Don, and he said, oh, Don had told him to look me up or something. And one of them wrote for the Chicago paper, and the other one, I guess, may have been a reporter or a freelancer. He's written a number of books since then. But Phil Hart had an automatic pen, and the automatic pen was an actual legal signature. And he also had a robotyper. And so there was one young man who was responsible for answering all this mail that came in and dividing it into categories so that one letter, form letter, would go to people who wanted to talk about immigration, somebody else for Social Security, and then all of them would be passed through this automatic pen. And so somehow they asked about that. This fellow asked me, and I said yes, you know, and then I ended up on like the front page of the Chicago paper, and they say, oh, you mustn't tell people things like that, because it was rather new then that, you know, so people thought they were all getting these nice little pieces of mail from the senator, and he actually wasn't writing those letters or signing them at all, you know. But,
so you went on, and you mentioned in passing your later husband, Art Holland, who then went on to be the mayor of Trenton for many years and was a beloved, much admired politician. But before that, when you were working for Phil Hart, he became a beloved, much admired politician too.
He was. And it's kind of interesting.
It must be your influence on these people.
Yes, I know, their influence on me. And Phil Hart was living there in Washington. He had 8 or 9 children, I can't remember how many. And his wife had not come yet from Michigan with these kids. So he was living in one of the hotels downtown. So there was one time when Art was coming to visit, and one of my roommates, we had a house on First Street, Southeast, across from the House Office Building, at an apartment. And I went into the senator and asked him if he'd like to come for dinner. I mean, that was, when I think of it, it was kind of ridiculous for me to do that, but I did it. And he said, oh, okay. And so he walked over, and we lived on the 2nd floor, and he knocked at the door, and Art answered the door, and Art always sort of made a joke of it, because he thought that Phil Hart was very timid, because Phil Hart would say, I'm Phil Hart. He was nothing boisterous about this man. He was quiet and nice. So anyway, he came in, and we gave him a drink of some kind, and then we asked him if he'd stay, and he said no, he had seen the steaks, and he didn't think there was going to be enough, and so he left. But he invited us to have lunch with him in the Capitol building, where I would see Jackie Kennedy sitting there, and people would be talking about her. This was before the presidential election, you know, with her bouffant hair, and you would be eating Senate bean soup and, you know, feeling really important. It was really a good life. So anyway, so there was, and I told Phil Hart I was leaving Washington.
That was after how long?
Well, I was there for only about 2 years, and I had met Art here, and now we had known each other 4 years, I guess, almost, and I was supposed to decide whether or not I was going to get married, so I was going to go back to New Jersey. And he said he thought it was a good decision because it was okay. It was good to be, if you were a big fish, it was good to be where he was in this. But if you were not, it's better to work at the smaller level. And so anyway, I have this picture because Phil Hart had an integrated staff. 2 of his people were African Americans, his private secretary, and then another woman who was a caseworker. And the woman, Ann Ball, they both came from Michigan. And actually a lot of us did not. And when people would come from Michigan, he'd be yelling, anybody out there from Michigan? You know, because they want to meet people from Michigan. And the first person he met was from New Jersey. You know, where are you from? So anyway, Ann Ball went down to the salon in the Senate office building to have her hair done. And they told her they couldn't do it. And so Phil Hart went down there and told them that they were going to do her hair, and they did. And so he was, it's then after that, because I had this experience with him, and I marry Art Holland, and we move into this integrated so-called neighborhood that people call the slum. It was the same kind of thing, you know, the same kind of focus, because Jet Magazine then came to do a big article on Phil Hart. And so there's this picture of us all sitting with him at his desk.
With the staff?
Yes, the staff. And I'm sitting right next to him, which is quite an honored position. And so years later, at the time I didn't think of it, I sent it back to him when I heard he was going to leave the Senate and not run. I couldn't understand why anybody would do that because they all wanted to die there, you know. And he wrote back and he said, oh, there are other things I want to do. And so I had asked him if he would autograph it. And so he autographed it, and he said, for Betty Holland, who even at this young age was great. So I thought that was quite
very nice.
He was like that, though. People wrote to him, and even though he had that pen, you know, that I described, he would send personal notes to people. And he was very personable.
The latest Senate office building was named for him with, as I recall, enthusiastic bipartisan support.
It was, and that also was funny, I think, because actually there were 3 senators there, all of whom had had arm injuries in the Second World War. Phil Hart was wounded at D-Day. Inouye was wounded, I guess, I don't know if it's either in the Pacific or in Europe someplace. And then I won't be able to quickly grab his name. Dole. He was wounded in Sicily, I guess. They all ended up in the same hospital. And Dole later said, we thought Phil Hart was going to be an A&P clerk or something. He was always running around getting baseball tickets for people or something, you know, and they all ended up in the Senate. And I just thought that was the most incredible thing. And he was known as the conscience of the Senate. And when they had this big announcement, he came to it, and they told him that they were going to name this office building after him, and they did. And I went down there once after it was opened, and the subway system is so much more complicated than it was then. And I asked this woman, is this the Hart office building? She says, yes, but not Gary Hart. I said, I know. So anyway, he was really an especially fine person.
So you came back to New Jersey.
I worked for the Tricentenary Commission. That actually,
was a state commission?
Yeah, it was to celebrate New Jersey's 300th anniversary as a entity, you know, Nova Caesarea or whatever. And actually Dick McCormick was head of the commission. And eventually I married Art Holland, who was the mayor when I married him. And we had met here at Ben Baker's class on municipal administration across town. And married and had a number of children and moved in, as I said, to this neighborhood that got a lot of publicity in 1963 because we were moving next to a black family, and everybody in the block was either, they were elderly whites or young blacks and Hispanics. So we got a lot of publicity television and international news, and every year they would come back to see if we were there. And
Was this neighborhood known as Mill Hill before you got there?
No, it wasn't. It was not. It was just Mercer Street, and actually, it was after we moved there. Art lost the next election, and so then the new mayor. I don't know if it had been something that had been started under Art's administration or not. I can't recall, but it became a redevelopment area known as Mercer Jackson. So it was HUD got involved, and they tore down some of the houses, and some people started to follow us, and now it's a very successful area, and it's known as Mill Hill because Stacy had built his mill in Trenton, right there at the head of Broad Street.
And then you ran for the city council at some point, right?
I
know
did.
You ran for Congress, and the city council was first, or?
No, actually, I ran for Congress, and I guess I always had this yearning. I don't know that I'd be any good at it, but and it made me nervous. But anyway, here was my husband going all around doing these things. The children were now pretty well grown, and we went to Taiwan, where the U.S. Conference of Mayors sent a troop every year because they wanted to keep some kind of relationship there for some reason. And over there, I pulled off one of these things. If you go into a Buddhist temple, it's like fortune telling. You pull off a slip of paper and it tells you something. And it said, this was the year to do everything, or something like that. So I came home, and the Democrats in Mercer County were looking for a candidate to run against Chris Smith, who had been there then for several terms. And other people who were pretty prominent had all lost to him, so obviously nobody wanted to run against him. And so evidently Art said to Blasey Camarada, what about Betty? And they said, oh, great, the good sacrificial lamb. So they did have a county convention, and I was nominated. Actually, I competed with Reed Gashura. He wanted to run that year, and then he became my campaign manager.
Oh.
So we had
this was 86, maybe?
It was 88.
88,
so
okay.
we've had a friendly relationship. And so I ran, and I did defeat a mayor, a Democratic mayor from Manalapan, who accused me of running because my husband was mayor. And in the general election, I guess I got something over 30% of the vote, which was pretty much what the others had gotten. So I did that, and then when Art died in '89, it wasn't quite the end of his term. His term would end in '90, in July the 1st. The man who was named acting mayor, who was president of city council, called me and asked me if I wanted to run for mayor, and I had no intention of running for mayor. And so anyway, but at the last minute, people were telling me, oh, you got to run for something. And so at the sort of last minute, I decided I would run for council. And I ran at large, and I won. I was a high vote getter. And so at the end of 4 years, I don't know what I really expected to do, but my son Matthew said I should run for mayor, and other people were telling me to run. And I had no heart to run, really. But so at the last minute I did, and was beat soundly by Doug Palmer, who was then the city mayor. Anyway, and the thing is, though, he had to raise so much money to run, which was interesting because I don't know if I frightened him or not, but it was like money that nobody had ever heard of in Trenton before. I mean, Art ran, he was accepting these little contributions, and there was never a lot of money spent. So anyway, that was the end of my political career.
Well, it's always fun to talk to you. Is there other thoughts you have about Eagleton?
Only that, had I not come here, my life would have been so different. I mean, I really, truly enjoyed working in Washington, and I think had it not been for Eagleton and for Neil McDonald and Don Hertzberg, who knows what would have happened.
Thanks.
So I enjoyed talking to you, John.